All right. Well, first, let me welcome everybody to this Lunch and Learn session. I hope that you all are having a good day so far at TechShare Pro. If there's ever any problem with my video stream, let me know. All right. So today, thank you for joining us for God of War Ragnarök, Designing Accessibility for AAA Games. Today, we're going to talk about the challenges of working on an accessibility for a AAA franchise and how we took a game from a handful of accessibility features to around 70. So I'm going to start us out telling you a little bit about myself. I'm Mila Pavlin, lead UX designer at Santa Monica Studio in Los Angeles, California. I use the pronouns she, her. People know me for working on God of War PC, God of War Ragnarök, but I also have worked on keyboards, mice, laptops, phones, you name it. I hold 3 patents when it comes to streaming and virtual reality, and I've worked on educational software, mobile games, website development. So all of this brought together a singular philosophy. I believe in empowering people, setting standards of ethical and accessible content, guiding teams that create seamless and engaging games, free of unintended frustrations, and I'm dedicated to finding solutions to address equality and equity. So first, let's get a taste of God of War Ragnarök with this audio-described trailer that we released at the beginning of our advertising.
Logo PlayStation Studios. In a snowy forest,
everyone keeps secrets.
Atreus rests his palm on a birch tree. Light radiates from his touch.
Sometimes it's the only way to protect the ones we love.
Kratos drops the blades of chaos and lays down the Leviathan axe. Santa Monica Studio. Kratos cuts a rope-freeing Tyr.
I know you.
Tyr sits in prison.
God killer.
They open a temple door.
What is it you want from me?
Kratos grapples an elf.
Is it a god of war you came to find?
Tyr drags the body across a bridge of light. Shadowy figure at the door.
You don't really want war, do you, Kratos?
Visions of prophecy.
All that blood on your hands, on your son's hands.
Atreus holds a marble.
What is it you will not tell me?
Kratos confronts
I can't
Atreus.
talk about it, but I just need you to trust me.
Examining a mural.
We follow your every whim,
But you don't believe in any of it.
and still I follow.
Freya ensnares Atreus.
Because all that matters is that you are safe.
But that's not all that matters.
Taking mistletoe arrow.
Who's keeping you safe?
I do not need you to protect me.
You sure about that?
Kratos and Atreus are attacked by 2 Valkyries. They hurl Kratos off a ledge.
But the old father!
Death can have me when it earns me.
He shield carries a massive creature. Blades of chaos slash through Hellwalkers. Shield glowing, he knocks an elf. He wrestles an enemy by its tongue.
What do you even know of God's word?
Kratos battles Einriyar.
In your lifetimes, has anyone ever worshipped you?
Atreus shoots a Trekkie.
Ever prayed to you?
Kratos encounters a magma creature.
Can you even imagine that kind of love? No!
Blades of chaos erupt in fire.
You don't care about anything beyond yourself,
Kratos covered in blood.
beyond the monster who kills without cause.
He runs with a wounded figure on his back through explosions and falling trees. He saves Atreus from falling off a sled. He rescues Atreus from drowning. They stand with 2 giant wolves under an eclipsed sun. Atreus draws back an arrow.
Fate only binds you if you let it.
A wolf rockets upwards, tearing through the sky, chasing the sun away to reveal the night. Light of all time pulses.
Do what is necessary.
A mermaid approaches. Ravens on a frozen tree.
Because it is written.
A mythical sea creature flies into the sky. Tyr and Kratos clasp hands in brotherhood. Kratos throws the Leviathan axe into Thor's hammer. Logo, God of War, Ragnarok.
We will make our own destiny.
Recalling their weapons, they collide in battle. Pre-order now, November 9, 2022. Play has no limits.
So I want to talk about that bold statement. Play has no limits. So if we want to have players have a great experience, we must remove limits, also referred to as unintended barriers. So when you watch that trailer, a lot of things, that experience of having a global phenomenon happen is something that players want to participate in. If they face barriers, then they might not be able to play those games. An example of barriers that players might face, imagine that you're playing your favorite game after everyone has gone to sleep. You have to keep the volume off on the TV since you don't want to wake up your whole family. But when you get to a puzzle, you have to follow a sound. Suddenly, you can't finish that puzzle because having the sound off presented a barrier to progress. This would be a temporary barrier for most people, but some folks experience the game that way all the time. Other more elusive barriers might come from subject matter of the game itself. Maybe it isn't relatable or doesn't have themes or content that you don't want to connect with. They can create social barriers that could keep the player from playing. So to understand how a game is accessible, we have to build games that allow players to remove barriers, but still create challenge. A way that we can make them fun, but also make sure that players can complete the game. So I found myself pondering over and over, how do we take this vast list of barriers and still provide ways for players to connect? A couple of things that you should know is that 2 in 7 households have a family member with a disability. 29% of gamers are over the age of 50. None of us are getting any younger. And 43% of players use features that are exclusive to the accessibility menu. And this will fluctuate over time, but these are kind of some general things that we look at when we're looking at games. I do want to express that there are many other studios that we look to when it comes to accessibility, and we knew that we had some big shoes to fill. Following the launch of other PlayStation titles, with some epic accessibility features, we knew that players were going to expect that a game as large as God of War was going to have an expectation of having accessibility. We wanted to reach the largest audience possible. So on launch, after 4+ years of working, we have a staggering number of accessibility features, but this journey was difficult for us and at times overwhelming. How do we as designers even begin to tackle this problem to make our game more accessible? On top of that, AAA games of this scope are miracles on their own to realize, and they are a collection of hundreds of people doing work. So let's look at some of the deciding factors of what we picked. I do want to acknowledge that we had a couple of features that we got specific help from other studios for, including Last of Us Part 2. Naughty Dog Studios helped us around a navigation assist, audio cues, and directional indicators. Ratchet & Clank really helped us around high contrast examples and low vision reviews. So our AAA factors that we look at are impact to player. So first and foremost, the impact to players, the players will face, the biggest barriers that they'll face are coming from the players themselves, telling us, what is preventing them from actually picking up the controller, from playing the game, from understanding the game. We get those big rocks in first. We then start to look at the complexity of the design. How much time should this take? How much effort will be needed to make and maintain this feature? And this is judged against scalability to see how the feature is going to work across the whole game. This in turn leads to cost of the feature and people hours and sometimes equipment, and of course scheduling to meet deadlines. I won't spend a lot of time on the last two as those change each project, but the first three are really where design has the most responsibility. We look at 4 impact areas: hearing, vision, motor, and cognitive. We focus our design on these 4 key areas, and I'll break these down in the next sections. Hearing, how specifically do you play the game with the sound turned off? Are there any sounds or speech that are critical to the game? Vision, can you play your game with your back to the screen? What is missing if you do? Are there sounds that could be added to describe these things? Motor, what about controls? Are you required to hold a controller? Are you required to press buttons? How many buttons is too many? Can you play with one hand? Are button holds and mashes required? Are there ways to minimize that? And cognitive, probably the most important across the game. How do players know what to do, where to go, and what they need to remember? Are there ways to help them remember these things, and what their objectives are? These questions, when applied to a game, will often lead to design changes or options, like baking a blueberry muffin. It's my favorite analogy here, and this is thanks to the accessibility community. It's always better to put blueberries into the batter at the start rather than waiting until after you bake the muffin to try and put them in. So, working on a AAA game presents unique problems of scale. Maintaining accessibility across multidisciplinary teams is hard enough on small projects, but with AAA, every small problem is amplified. With a mission to create the most accessible products, we must start looking at integration of accessibility into the core of the design. And so I'm going to use this chart to kind of show what the ideal that we were looking at for how much should be integrated, how many things should be modular solutions, which are modular scripting are fallbacks when the integrated solutions don't work. These are things that are situational, in which we create drag and drop solutions. And then hand scripting being things that are more costly and require long hours of testing to make sure nothing is breaking the logic. These are usually for hand keyed moments or things that are very specific to a situation that aren't used other places. And we of course want to always consider designing and planning in our calculations. So what you're looking at here is the ideal is that we really want those integrated solutions to be the majority of our use, and then have smaller amounts of modular and hand scripting to make sure that it's scalable across the game. So I'm going to take you through our different impact areas and how they lined up to this in reality. Hearing, we're going to kick off with one of the most standardized of categories. To break down this category of work, I'll display this chart at the start of each section. Hearing was a defined pipeline. It had a lot of core integrated workflows, but since it needed additional functionality when we started the game, adding in the caption systems, we spent a lot of time developing modular systems that would handle captions. Captions for cinematic moments were also included the majority of our hand scripted moments for things that weren't handled by even the modules. But since every cinematic in the game required special attention, we wanted to make sure that we handled things right. We started with this philosophy of matching film and TV closed caption systems. So you can see here an example of our integrated systems and the subtitles. We constructed as a part of the underlying banter system so that each dialogue audio file was implemented and had a corresponding subtitle line. So we offered a lot of options that allowed players to customize their subtitles, and the speaker systems were automated based on characters who spoke the line, and direction indicators were tied to the character's model in game so that it would point directly to the character model. This gave us kind of a baseline system to work off that we could then make some adjustments to in case-by-case basis. The modular aspects came with the timing and word count per line. So even though a program could do rough line breaks and rough line counts, we gave the power to our narrative QA to adjust these line counts and timings for easier reading. Captions were also implemented on a modular basis, within different game elements having a caption module assigned to them so that when they made noise in the world, it would trigger a caption. These presented a one-time cost per module that would then propagate out to all of them. An example here, we have a combination of subtitles and captions with sounds. In special cases, we used custom scripting to handle situations where there might be multiple conversations with overlap. We also had hand scripted.
But I can't actually hear.
I think somebody's mic is on. Sorry. So we also did handle scripting of specific moments in the game where specific noises would be encountered that were not part of the standard gameplay. Subtitles and captions were an absolute must for any game, so we make sure that these are meeting the minimum standards of your work. So let's move on to motor. Motor was the category that was most closely aligned with the ideal workload balance and ideal distribution. Most of the work was core engine work. So flowing down to behavior modules and level scripted modules, we only did hand scripting for very specific instances where we didn't have the items within a modular asset. Motor is one of the trickiest parts to get right because there's a wide variety of barriers that can stop someone from play. We often design games with a large number of buttons that a player has to press. And what we needed to discover were what the key minimum interactions of players must actually do and offer them a way to minimize the impact of other options. We were very fortunate to have a team member who understood one-handed gameplay very well and gave us insight into the barriers and blockers that our controls presented. It gave us a unique insight into how to approach controls on more efficient button presses and uses. We asked, could we play with limited buttons? Could we allow taps or holds to be converted into other inputs? And finally, could we also allow remapping? We kept hearing from players that they wanted to customize their controls as much as possible, even after release, reaching out to us with new suggestions for new features that would improve customization even further. As a baseline, making sure that the full controller had remapping was essential to a large number of features. Remapping individual buttons was a great start, and I highly encourage you to focus on building a solution of solid and integrated foundation into your engine. The modular complexity really started with what we called button chords. or dual input actions. These can present problems for players with motor accessibility concerns. Working with players, we developed unique setups to help reduce the number of simultaneous button inputs required, although we do know that some still remain in the game. We knew that in the game where the whole where the whole controller is used, we would need to make specific sacrifices to free up buttons. Adding actions like swipes and toggles began to relieve pressure when then combined with adding automated features like traversal assist, auto pickup, and auto minigame support to further reduce button requirements. So to break down this, integrated core button were assigned to actions. Our combat systems were integrated in having all of their button chords integrated into the system. Modular, we had QTE moments that were drag and drop. We created special actions that were part of that system, and then added chord support within our settings menu. We did have to do hand scripted narrative moments and edge cases to avoid blockers and reduce fatigue. So I want to look at some of the things that really helped us to reduce button presses. One of them was traversal assist, and so I have a little video of that now. As you can see, you approach this crack, and as you press forward without any touching of the controller, simply move forward. As we walk to approach this mantle point, or this vault point, you vault over it with just pressing forward. So each one of these types of traversal were their own individual module. So as you can see here, we have two more. We're going to have two more, one small mantle and then one larger mantle. So these presented individual problems, and that we had to solve each one of these types of traversal individually. But that removed one button press from the player's interaction. So we continued that logic with auto pickup. Auto pickup, as you approach a loot object, it's going to automatically pick up that loot object for you when you're out of combat. This was especially difficult for us to do because we had to categorize things based on whether a player was in combat or out of combat to make sure that we weren't interrupting the player's combat experience with them stopping to pick up loot but could potentially get a player into a bad situation. And so we only picked up health crystals and rage crystals while in combat. So here the player is going to approach the loot pickup, and it just automatically picks up without them having to do any input. So the last thing that we did that I think is probably one of the most important ones for combat was we thought about players who would have difficulty using both sticks while in combat. So because we are in a situation in which you have look controls and you have movement controls as separate sticks, we did allow the sticks to swap positions so that a player could choose which one was comfortable for them. But when in combat, we used a technique called recenter on attack, which gave the players the option to automatically rotate their camera towards enemies while swinging their weapon. So you can see in this example, as we swing, we're rotating around. So this is effectively acting like a magnet towards the enemies, and it's using a priority system based on the enemy that you last hit to say that that enemy is the priority and continue to attack them. This way, the player could use fewer inputs while they were going through the situation. And I actually find that for players that are new to the game, this oftentimes will present an easy way to onboard them into the system without having to get used to the controls that much. So I'm going to step forward into Vision. We have a lot of features, so I can't go into each and every single one of them, but Vision was very important to us when, as a category considering the last game. Vision turned out to be a much broader category and required us to break it down into different target audiences. As we had players who wanted to play from the couch, we had players with low vision, and then we had players who might have, might be blind or not be able to utilize anything on the screen. So we had to integrate different solutions for different players, but I'm going to start from playing from the couch. As you can see here, this required the most hand scripting out of all the categories. This is probably the most expensive category to work in, but it's also presents a category of players that is very broad reaching. So the first thing we wanted to address when we got in was we knew in 2018 that our default text size was really, really small. As you can see in the top there is an example of the 2018 default text size. It's barely readable on the screen. So as a minimum, we doubled our text size for the new default, and then we added options to scale up to a larger text size throughout all of our UI elements. You can see that our tiny text size in comparison, it's a huge difference when trying to read from the couch or trying to read at a distance. So this, of course, required us to do a reconfiguration of our entire screen to make sure that we were allotting proper space for every element. You can see on the left, the 2018 version. On the right, we have the larger text version. It requires a lot more space on screen, and so therefore we had to be a lot more minimalistic with what we were putting into each category and making sure that we were breaking things up across multiple screens. We had to integrate things like scrolling, clipping, box sizes, multi-line wrapping, and then we created modules for different types of screen interactions. So we had different layouts for when you're in the shop versus when you're in your equipment menu, and different equipment types would have to have different modules in order to handle all of this wrapping and scaling. We had to hand script some localization issues and some special cases, but fortunately for us, a lot of the work that we did on the scaling actually helped with those issues. So one of the things that we found as going through this is that you are going to solve localization issues by concentrating on having wrapping and larger text, because everything is going to just naturally kind of focus and wrap as you go through. So I'll hit the second big issue that we had last game, which was cinematic camera shake. Motion sickness is something that affects a large number of people in this world. And last game, we had a lot of control over the in-game shake, but when it came to cinematics, we didn't have any control. So I am going to show a video that does include some shake. We're going to have a smooth version in the upper left and a shaky version on the lower right. I want to make sure that if you have motion sickness, maybe it's good to look away at this point. But I'm going to play through this video twice. I picked one that is a more subtle version, and that's specifically because I didn't want to get anybody motion sick during this presentation. So I'm going to play the video now. It'll loop through twice. Top left is smooth, bottom right is not. So it may not seem like a big difference, but those individual and minor camera shakes are additive over the course of the game. So every time the camera bounces uncontrollably, it shakes uncontrollably, it starts to add to motion sickness for players. And so over the course of many cinematics, this could build and cause people nausea. And so we wanted to make sure that we were preventing that from the very beginning. With the cinematic smoothing, we've had reports from players that they've been able to play longer sessions without experiencing motion sickness. And so we feel like this was something that, although it was very difficult to do, because we were using hand cams for these shots, where we actually had people physically holding cameras and moving around. There was a lot of camera shake that we had to remove. But we were able to go through a process in order to do that. So our automated first pass got rid of a lot of our camera shake. We then had to use modules to assign profiles to each content to tell whether it was a high action scene or whether it was something that was lower that we could do more removal on. And then we did hand scripted moments for anything that was very high action that we required very specific camera angles on, because sometimes the camera movement was required in order to keep people in frame. So we're going to look at some examples of high contrast mode. High contrast mode being, a vision, something that is very important for the vision community. To increase contrast against the background, we offered this contrast mode that would color things like enemies, friends, loot, interactables like doors to make them pop out. We also let players turn the background to a monotone gray to allow everything to stand out better. We let players customize each component so they could choose what color each highlight was. So remember that whenever you're using color, you need to have options, because if someone is colorblind, it might present an additional barrier on top of that. So we have these combinations of problems that we have to deal with when we're looking at color. In addition to all this, we added unique sounds to on-screen to help players visualize things better. So we can take a look at this in action. Here we have Kratos is blue. We've got these two nice little friendly wolves, which are green, and we've grayed out the background. So to increase contrast against the background, we offered these color changes, but we did make sure that some lighting would affect these, the color within the environment. We wanted to make sure that we kept a cinematic feel to everything, even in the high contrast mode, and also lighting plays an important factor in certain scenes in which player is not supposed to see things, and so maintaining that across, especially in dark scenes, it was very important that we maintain a connection between the cinematic feel and the high contrast at the same time. So overall, we did integrate these things like colors for characters and background objects. We had modules for things like environmental pickup, loot, enemies, locked or unlocked chests. And then we had to hand script narrative moments in which there was, maybe something had to change color for a specific reason, or there were a special case. And then I also want to talk a little bit about navigation assist as we wrap down. This is for low vision and blind players. Navigation assist is, and also very effective for cognitive, that navigation assist turns your camera towards the point that you're trying to reach. This was probably one of the toughest things to do in the game, as it has a lot of complexity when it comes to the environment, especially in one that's realistic, like trees blocking your way or little rocks that are in the navigation. We utilized our internal compass system, so the team was already building that for quest navigation. So we got a large portion of the first pass of the work for free, but the last portion where we're looking at puzzle navigation or providing navigation when the compass wasn't present, we had to do a lot of hand scripting. So when you hear the ping, we are actually activating the navigation to turn the camera. As you can see, it's just rotating them towards the path as they go along. Okay. So you probably heard in there the audio cue. So audio cues were added in. This was feedback from specifically from a blind player, where they said when an interact prompt appears, they were not able to actually understand that the interact was there, and so didn't know to push the button. So we added a unique sound to each one of the button prompts, and we were actually helped out a lot by Naughty Dog on this particular one, with some of the audio sounds being identical to or very close to the ones used in The Last of Us Part 2. So you can hear a distant prompt, and then the ping when it appears. So to break this down, we have core integrated systems, but we had to, with basically our integrated systems came with our core compass system, base icon sounds, and our combat rings were integrated into everything. We had to add alternative layouts, boss QTs, and vehicle navigation as modules. And then we had some hand scripting when it came to puzzle setups, when navigation gets stuck, or when there's a conflict between what navigation wants to do and what the compass needs to do. So we'll wrap our last category, cognitive. Cognitive is by far the most bespoke and hand scripted of all the categories, and it's the one that is the hardest to hit the targets on, I think. Generally, gathering feedback, playtesting your game with the community, you can gain a lot of value and insight into how to assist with cognitive. It is very hard line to balance, though, because if you go too far into giving players too much information, then they get upset that they feel like the game might be telling them too much too quickly. If you don't give them enough information, they get frustrated at not having enough information. And so there's this fine line between that. We did try to use some scripting and hand scripting to allow us to understand the intent of the player, make sure that we weren't being too upfront in the beginning of the menus for those players that had been very versed in our game going forward, so that if there were certain tutorials that we knew a player was already doing, for example, we have a sprint tutorial, but they're already sprinting, we can dismiss that tutorial before it even shows up on screen. Cognitive can be tricky at first, but if you go through your game with the eyes of the new player and test your game early and often, you can address a lot of these issues. So we actually did tutorial planning very early on in the game, working with our level designers, making sure that everything was working within the flow of what the player needed to understand. And we did cognitive load testing, where we actually were comparing our tutorialization against cognitive load to see when players were mastering a particular skill, and testing this against playtests to see whether or not we were reaching too much of a cognitive load, always trying to keep underneath that red line of what we consider to be kind of the maximum cognitive load that a player could have. There were a lot of mechanics in God of War Ragnarok, so the spreadsheet that we had to be updated often with new information and rechecked against cognitive load constantly. We also added in a lessons learned page, which will allow players to go back and reread different techniques or lessons or tutorials that we had along the way. And this would allow players to refresh if they were away for a long period of time, or if they needed to just understand a tip that was just given to them. So I'm going to give you a video of it all together, just so you can kind of see all of these things working in conjunction. And then I'll start taking some questions.
All right, where's that trail gone?
Right before an attack hits, tap block button to parry.
Too many for a scouting party. They must have a camp nearby.
All right, so thank you, everyone. Let's go out there and make our games diverse, inclusive, and accessible for everyone. Every step forward lets one more player play with no limits. So let's make play have no limits for everyone. I see a question. Hairstylist, yes, I use Cece. She's in Los Angeles. Cece the stylist. So good plug there. All right, I'm just looking through the questions here. If anyone has questions, feel free to post them into the chat.
Hi, Mila. There's also, if you go onto the Sessions tab in Slido, there's a few questions there for you as well.
Okay. So I had a question here. Were there performance considerations to account for in any of these, the colorizations perhaps? So yes, I'm going to talk a little bit about the high contrast mode when it comes to colorization. It was very important during scenes that we keep the narrative intent for a particular scene. So you might have something where you have a cinematic moment in which an enemy is slain, and you want to make sure that the color of the enemy changes at the correct moment, where in the cinematic, they might not actually be killing the enemy from the game engine side, but we need to show that on the in the cinematic. And so we would have to apply a color within that, timing it out to the correct moment. Or for example, if a player is handed something and it passes from a character who's an NPC to the hero, we might need to change the color from NPC to hero color as it passes from one to another. And so those are all hand scripted moments that we need to go in and tune. Sometimes this is really important because it could give away a spoiler if you have the person be the wrong color or if you have the item be the wrong color in a particular moment. And so as you go through, as you play through God of War Ragnarok, there will be a couple of moments in which if you play with the high contrast mode and keep the high contrast cinematics on, you will see the care that we took to make sure that colors were changing correctly as we went along. So let's see. Going back through these. When adding accessibility features, do different versions have different features, or are all the features from PS5 version the same on other versions? So when you're looking at accessibility, we try to make sure that every relevant accessibility feature is available on any platform that we are working on. So if you have something that is on PS4 or PS5, we want to make sure that those accessibility features are shared across the board. The only exception to that are things that are hardware driven. For example, the DualSense versus DualShock controller. Those might have different accessibility features that are just not physically possible on the other controller. So the haptics that you receive when you're using the PS5 controller are going to be much more tactile and much more experiential than if you're playing on the PS4, for example. Or the 3D audio is going to be much more robust when it comes to the PS5. But with that in consideration, everything else is going to share across the platforms. So there's a question about handling, how do you handle choice when looking at accessibility, like exploring auto nav, or when picking up health crystals, or when auto pickup in combat? So I'll start with the navigation. Navigation is probably the toughest one to understand player intent, and that is the statement we always come back to is, what is the player's intent in a given situation? And we have to look at our game and figure out, is there a way that we can determine what the player is trying to do by their action? For us, we relied on the tracking of quests to determine navigation goals. So if a player is in a particular situation and they track a side quest, we are going to consider that side quest to be the primary navigation. If they don't have a side quest tracked, we're going to assume that they want to be on the main path. If they pick a pin on the map, for example, like a dock or a particular area like a realm travel gate, we are going to navigate to them to that at the top. So we have kind of a stack ranking system where we say, pin first, then side quest, then main quest. And as you go through those, you can determine, what the player is attempting to do at a given moment. Now, this might have some flaws in it, in that if a person forgets that they've tracked something, then they might be led to a location that they didn't think that they were going to. But that is kind of the only way that we can understand intent. So, all right, let's see if there's more questions here. What do you see as the future for accessibility in AAA titles? Are there accessibility features that you're working on for the future? So in response to this question around the future of accessibility, I think that really what we're looking at is that vision category growing. Because right now, vision was so hand-tailored and hand-done that it was very difficult and hard to do in the long run. We need to create more integrated solutions. We need to move those into something that is part of the core game engine so that it's easier to implement over the future, because there's a lot of features we didn't get to. You might have seen in The Last of Us Part 1, they had audio descriptions. Audio descriptions are very key to a player understanding what's going on, similar to how we did the descriptive audio for the trailer. Someone who is low vision or blind may not understand what is going on in a particular scene when it comes to the character's actions, or if they're doing something visual. And especially in a game like God of War Ragnarok, where there's a lot of somber, silent moments in which there's not a lot of ambient audio to describe the scene, Players can be sitting for a while going, I'm not sure what's going on because all I hear is just people breathing, and they're really expressing through their emotions or actions the things that they would want to do. So I would think that those are areas that we can definitely improve on, and that as an industry, we should be looking for more support for low vision and blind play, because I feel like that is an area where AAA games tend to reach the most barriers for content. Even with all the features that we added in, we still had blind players say that they had to get sighted assistance for a few key moments within the game. And those are things where we just had puzzles that were visual in nature, and it was very difficult for us to create a solution that was going to be easily understood for someone without sight. Now, this is something that can be improved. There are probably solutions to these things, but it may take time for us to figure out. So pushing forward into blind and low vision play is very important. So great to see a collab with Naughty Dog regarding certain accessibility behaviors. Do you anticipate more of this in the future with other devs, perhaps to create open source resources? So I would say that this is a very important thing within the industry. We need to share this information as widely as possible, because the hardest part of accessibility, and this is something I experienced on this project, was understanding where to begin. A lot of times in development, you look at a problem and you can't think of a solution because there's so much ahead of you that it seems impossible. But when you talk to another developer, they give you a single word, a single phrase, and suddenly you unlock the solution. We found that for high contrast, we went from not thinking that we could do it at all to the point where we thought this was completely impossible in our engine. It was too costly. We weren't going to be able to get it done. We spoke to another developer. They expressed basically a couple of ideas about how they would approach it. We went back to our rendering team, and within a day had a working prototype of the high contrast mode. Sure, it took a lot of work after that to make sure that it was tuned and that it was in place, but that move from impossible to something that was in the game over just a couple of days is amazing. And that can happen just with a simple conversation. It doesn't take a lot of technical detail because every engine is different, but it's something that really helps you to focus and say, these are the problems that I need to solve. Looking through to see if there's any other comments or questions here. All right, so hopefully I didn't miss anybody's questions, but if there's any more, I think I have time for one or two. Oh, I did forget to go over the auto pickup question for the health crystals. Sorry, so I'll go back to that one. So when it comes to the automatic pickup, we had to make certain decisions around what the criteria were going to be for auto pickup. And we made a determination that we would always make sure the player had lost health before we picked up some like a rage crystal or a health crystal, and make sure that it would actually benefit them in some way. So those things during combat were really important, because if you have full health, you don't want to waste a health crystal. For the loot, we just made sure that anything that was tagged as loot did not get picked up in combat, because there's an animation associated with it that could cause the player to get hit. And we also made sure that any loot that had a specific narrative moment around it, we retained the button press. So if it was going to go into a long animation and have some banter lines, that a player would then initiate that on their own, so that we weren't automatically putting the player into a situation that they didn't want to be in. All right, so the last one here, great session. Thanks. Having a diverse team is surely a great way to find accessibility solutions for future games. I'm going to say diversity within the staff was 100% required for getting accessibility out the door. We needed to have people on site who had different disabilities to tell us when we were doing something wrong, to help us to find solutions, and to be there to help us guide us through those moments. So having folks on site who were hard of hearing, who had limited mobility, low vision, who maybe had color blindness or different motor fatigue, they all gave us different ways of approaching the problem and looking at the problem to make sure that we were meeting those requirements. Playtests are absolutely great, and I definitely recommend having as many playtests as possible, but also having that continuity on staff to be able to see a feature that is broken and not working, and then tune it until it works, and then take that to the playtest. Those are the things that are really important for making sure that we get things right. So there is a statement within the accessibility community: never about us without us. And so having people on staff helps us to fill that promise to the community, as well as continuing to have playtests with folks from the community. So I think that is about wrapping up our session here. I want to say thank you very much, everyone. I really enjoyed talking to you all today. If you have any further questions, please reach out to me on Twitter, and I hope that you all have a wonderful lunch. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mila. Just to say, David from Sony, just to thank you for today's presentation. Really informative, really inspiring. Appreciate it's very early in the US. It was a great session. You can see by the questions. Thank you very much for supporting the event, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you. Great session.
Thank you.